Bé, comencem la primera sessió d'aquesta, que serà en anglès, d'aquesta primera sessió, amb la professora Montserrat Guibernau, que ens tractarà justament el que és el subjecte, de la part més teòrica del subjecte del que és aquesta jornada, que és populisme versus nacionalisme cosmopolita. La doctora Montserrat Guibernau és catedràtica de Ciència Política del Queen Mary University de Londres. De totes maneres, la seva trajectòria acadèmica és molt llarga, està vinculada a l'Associació d'Estudi del Nacionalisme, de l'Etnicitat i el Nacionalisme, l'EISEN, de la London School of Economics. Jo diria que Montserrat Guibernau, que és nascuda de totes maneres aquí a Catalunya, a una ciutat de la conurbació de Barcelona, que és Vilanova i la Geltrú, doncs, de totes maneres, jo, si l'hagués de definir, diria que forma part d'aquests acadèmics que els hauríem de considerar acadèmics globals, és a dir, acadèmics transnacionals en bona mesura, en tant que partint de la seva pròpia experiència tenen una visió global del món. Per tant, Montserrat.
Moltes gràcies, Agustí, per aquesta presentació i moltes gràcies a la Fundació CatDem per haver-me convidat i a tots vostès per ser aquí en el dia d'avui. La conferència la faré en anglès perquè vam quedar així, però les preguntes les respondré en anglès o en català o en castellà o en francès, el que vulgui. Llavors, well, to talk about cosmopolitanism, I know that talking about cosmopolitanism means that quite a few people here will think, yes, cosmopolitanism is good, but nationalism has really a bad press. So what are these Catalans trying to do now? Are they trying to make it up so that they sound more decent, they sound more democratic, but are they really democratic, This is the key question. And what I'm going to try to do today in this lecture, that would last for about 45 minutes, something like that, is to, first of all, define the concepts, because I consider that when we go on and say, oh yes, I'm for cosmopolitanism, I'm a cosmopolitan, or I'm a nationalist, well, my question to you is, what do you mean by that? Because even if you say that you are a cosmopolitan, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that you've got fancy masks that, made of wood that you bought when you traveled to Africa? Does it mean that when you travel the world, you just stay in the Hilton wherever you go, so that it's really, really nice and cozy inside, and then you go and see the indigenous people, but from a distance? Do you go and buy these very nice artifacts that the locals produce, but do you care about the conditions of people making these artifacts or not? Are you a cultural cosmopolitan? Or are you a more philosophical cosmopolitan? Or are you somebody who defines himself or herself as cosmopolitan just because you defend the new institutions of global governance, the new political institutions brought about by globalization? Well, in the same sense that there is a certain complexity in the way in which nationalism is to be defined, there is a complexity in the way in which cosmopolitanism is defined. So I'm afraid it's a bit early in the morning to start with definitions, but I think it's the first thing we have to do, because otherwise we just don't know what we are talking about. Well, when we talk about nationalism, I would define nationalism, and I'll do it in a very simple way, as a sentiment of belonging to the nation. So nationalism has an emotional component, but nationalism, it's also a political ideology. It's a political ideology that, following Ernst Gellner, says that basically people have to be ruled or preferred to be ruled by their own. that people don't like to be ruled by alien people. This is what Gellner puts down in his book, and is something that more or less works. We could obviously define this for a long time. But it's also important to say that nationalism is genus-faced. This means nationalism has two faces. There are some cases in which nationalism is associated with xenophobia, with violence, with ethnic cleansing, with discrimination. But there are also some other cases in which nationalist movements defend the right of nations to exist, to promote or to maintain, to develop their culture, to have some political aspirations for self-determination. So you've got these differences in the objective of nationalism, but you also have differences in the means that nationalism employs. When you say, okay, I want to defend my culture, do you do it by killing all those that disagree with you? Well, this has been done in the past. It's a method. It has worked. And the consequences have been terrible. In Europe, we've got examples of that. Or do you want to defend your culture by peaceful means, in dialogue with other people, being able to kind of hang up and say, well, I think that this is the best option, but I'm open to listen to you, and I'm open to even change my mind. This is what nationalism in some instances is, especially when we talk about the democratic nationalism. There is also another quality of nationalism, which is its flexibility. Nationalism is an ideology that some people don't like, and they don't like it in principle. They don't even study what nationalism means or the different types of nationalism. Nationalism is just a no. This attitude doesn't lead very far, because one has to be able to study the differences, and also in the same way that democracy has different expressions in different parts of the world. Even in the European Union, democracy is not conceived in the same way exactly in all countries. And if we were to compare countries in Europe and countries in the Middle East, in other parts of the world, democracy is even more difficult. Well, with nationalism, there is something similar. You really need to know what the content of nationalism is, what is the meaning, and then you decide, you judge, because there are differences. And with nationalism, it's no good to simplify. If you simplify, you are never going to understand or even change things, because simplification loses the study of the details that make a difference, and this is why they are very important. Because nationalism is both an ideology of inclusion and inclusion. In some cases, it's an ideology of inclusion. All those who have these traits belong to the nation. In some cases, nationalism acts as an ideology of exclusion. You were not born here, your parents were not from here, you don't think, you don't believe about this, you don't speak that language, you don't do this, then you are excluded, no? So nationalism can be really employed with to fulfill very different aims. And nationalism, I would like to stress this particular point, is important also for its emotional component. People feel, usually even the coolest of them, and I know that we've got people from the northern countries here, but even in the coolest of countries, there is some passion about nationalism, be it for or against. Nationalism is not a neutral ideology. And this is something that from the late 18th century onwards generated some kind of hostility against nationalism. Because when we had the school of the philosophe, when we had all the period of the Enlightenment, at that particular time, reason was a liberation for humans, and it was something positive. Emotions, in general, were to be abandoned because they were not rational, they could not be controlled. And there is a legacy of this clash between reason and emotion also in nationalism. This is why when we look at classical social theory, we find that although, for example, Durkheim defended some nationalist positions himself, and Max Weber defended his own position as a German nationalist. I can go and develop this further in the debate if you want. They never constructed a theory of nationalism, and they never defined themselves as nationalists. So it's quite interesting. It's also interesting that nationalism has played a fundamental role in the development of Europe, just to limit our talk to Europe, and there are not many analyses that go deep enough into nationalism, because nationalism is usually employed to qualify a movement, to discard it or to keep it, but rarely to analyze it. And it's precisely this particular point, the one that I would like to make today, and then try to test some arguments with you and open a debate, open a dialogue, no? Because if this is nationalism, on the other hand, we've got cosmopolitanism, and you can say, well, she is really pressing it just to put the two titles together, just to put cosmopolitanism and nationalism. Well, let's see whether it works. I'm not the first one to do this, probably won't be the last one, but it's a possibility. And there are some cases that illustrate this particular situation when we study the world and when we study different movements across Europe. I'm going to be talking about Europe in this presentation. So, how can we define cosmopolitanism? In my view, there are two types of cosmopolitanism at least, just to know what we are talking about. First, there is a cosmopolitanism, that's the one that appears in adverts, in television. You ask somebody, they say, well, how do you find yourself? Well, I'm a cosmopolitan. And people, even if they don't understand what cosmopolitan means, it's something that comes across as positive. Cosmopolitan means that you've traveled the world, that you've taken a plane at least a few times. Otherwise, we're not really cosmopolitan. If you've always been traveling by train, you see, it's not quite that. Yeah, you have to be cosmopolitan. You must have probably a smartphone or an iPad nowadays, or if not an iPad, at least a very good computer, a portable, because cosmopolitan means that you are in the network of things. You are connected. The world is interdependent, and you have to be there, so you've got all these tools. But what I'm telling you now is a very banal definition of cosmopolitanism. It's not the definition of cosmopolitanism that I seek to develop when I talk about nationalism too. To be a banal nationalist, we all know, right? And I go to the UK where I live, and I go to Sainsbury's, which is a big supermarket, and I buy the fair trade coffee. Am I not cosmopolitan, contributing to all these good works in the world? But maybe, if you look deeper, I am not. It's only superficial. Let's talk about what it means to be a cosmopolitan, but from a more philosophical point of view. Cosmopolitanism stands for the freedom and equality of all human beings independently of their origin. So freedom and equality for all, independently or regardless of their origin. Cosmopolitanism defends human rights. Because obviously, I'm not going back to cosmopolitanism, to the Stoics definition, I'm not even going back to the Kantian definition, because it'll take me a lot more than 45 minutes. But nowadays, if we talk about cosmopolitanism, philosophically, it means defense of human rights. This is an important thing. And also it's important to establish at least 3 meanings of cosmopolitanism. The first one is a philosophical meaning of cosmopolitanism. Then this entails to be in favor of social global justice. And we've got people like Honora O'Neill who are defending this specific definition, global social justice. Then we've got a political way of defining cosmopolitanism, another meaning, political cosmopolitanism. This refers to the new spaces, transnational institutions that have been created thanks to the development of globalization. All these new spaces, and this is all the stuff that has been done about locales which are not based in space, but are based, for example, in the virtual world. These are some of the new spaces that political cosmopolitanism studies. And finally, there is a cultural cosmopolitanism, and when we talk about cultural cosmopolitanism, we basically talk about the idea that the world will produce eventually a hybrid culture. It's the end of pure cultures, because this is no longer viable, and cosmopolitanism, to be a cosmopolitan, it means that you actually defend this hybridity. We've got people like Charta Partagee who are defending this position, as well as many others. But when we analyze cosmopolitanism and we see that this idea, the defense of equality, the defense of freedom, as fundamental, as very important, so that all humans can develop their potential as human beings, for example, as preventing the fact that people die of hunger. I mean, how can you be cosmopolitan if you cannot eat and you die of hunger? I mean, there are certain conditions that need to be fulfilled in order for the world to be or to become a cosmopolitan place. But cosmopolitanism at present is regarded with certain suspicion from developing countries. Because in many developing countries, they see cosmopolitanism as a new strategy of the West to tell them what to do. Okay? We are cosmopolitans, we go there and we say, well, these are the norms. But they say, well, this goes against our own way of doing things. And this is it's a huge issue. The West says, we want to liberate you, and the others say, we don't want to be liberated. It's something like that. Or what you say is liberation for us is slavery, a slavery of the West once again. So this is a problem, and it's a problem which has huge consequences, because whenever you try to develop a global idea of cosmopolitanism, you have to bear in mind the different positions of people. The West, by many, is regarded as a center of sending orders. Now they colonize with troops, by war, by sending specific products, and now by telling people what they can and what they cannot do. It's difficult and it's problematic. And the other side of this has to do with the resurgence that we are now witnessing in many developing countries of traditional cultures, of principles that to a Western person that lives in a democratic state look backward, look even against human rights. And for women, definitely some of the practices look as an attempt to human rights, while in these countries of origin, they are presented as the tradition that defines their own way of being. So we've got all these specific conflicts in here. But now, after this introduction, which I hope has given some light into the definition of nationalism as complex, with two faces, and with this flexibility, and cosmopolitanism as this aim of freedom and also liberty for all individuals, regardless of their origin, we move on to the specific topic that when I read here, I thought, well, I have to talk about this then, you know? Even after an introduction that's quite long, I really have to face this. Populist nationalism. Well, what do I mean by that? Because I'm the one giving the talk, so I have to say what are the terms that I'm employing when I say populist nationalism. Well, I think that populist nationalism emerges across Europe. We've got different examples of it at the moment, and emerges with first a feeble force, but most recently it has been gaining more and more power. It has gained more and more power as the context in which Europeans live has been affected by anxiety about day-to-day life, anxiety about economic prospects, uncertainty about the future, and also by feelings of political alienation. All opinion polls in Europe talk about political alienation, and this is a big problem. That's not exclusive of any country. It's something that we all share. And in this context, populist nationalism emerges. There is another factor, and this is migration. This is controversial, fine? But migration, some types of migration have been employed to, or have had as an effect, the rise of populism in certain countries. In Spain, not so much. It won't last long, of course. But there are very strong cases of strong populist movements in France, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Austria, in Italy, and now if we look at Eastern Europe, there are also cases that are very, very important. But also, populism has expanded to northern countries, like Norway. Not with extreme right parties defined in the same way in which they are defined in southern countries, because in the north they talk about progress parties, which is a slightly different idea. It's not the same a progress party than a radical right party, but we can talk about this later on if you wish. But definition, what is populist nationalism? Well, populist nationalism is a type of nationalism which is ethnocentric. We are the best. If we are the best, all the others are inferior. If we are the best, we must rule. And the others have to follow, because they are inferior and they don't know. Or they can never know. These are the assumptions. And what are the main points or the main characteristics of populist nationalism? First of all, they present themselves as an anti-establishment ideology. They are against corruption. They are anti-elite. They are in favor of what they call, inverted commas, the common sense of people, right? This is the common thing that Marine Le Pen has used in France, that politicians in the different countries have been employing. Is always this idea, this anti-elite, and also they are programmatically in their documents, they are in favor of what I would define as some kind of hyper-democracy. Their discourse says our societies are not democratic, We need to make democracy more pure, right? Then there are other points apart from this anti-establishment. Another point is anti-immigration, not anti-all immigrants, no, but particularly anti-Muslims and against the expansion of Islam in Europe. These are the key points here. They are also in favor of Western values, and this is defended in many different ways in different countries, and they defend the so-called national preference principle. And as you can see, national preference principle means you go to the doctor, and there is a group of people from different countries. You happen to be from that country. You say, well, I'll go first. Well, that's it. And with the current economic crisis that we have, these ideas are gaining support. And it's just very hard. And political parties, mainstream parties, have to do, well, this is normative, but I consider that political parties have to really make an effort to fight these principles of populist nationalism. And finally, another point which I think is also interesting, this populist nationalism defends the integration of immigrants, fine, but they also defend ethnopluralism. They call it ethnopluralism. This comes from the French think tank Grèce and the work of Alain de Benoist. And the idea is that it's something that has been repeated by Jean-Marie Le Pen, and by Marine Le Pen, and by George Haider in Austria, and all different politicians. The idea is, well, I love Turks. This is a famous quote from Le Pen. I love Turks. I love their culture. But I love them when they are in Turkey. And they say, and what's better for them and for their culture to be preserved than for them to be in Turkey? This is ethnopluralism. The way they define it, even the word, is catchy and misleading. So, as you can see, the same with nationalism. Ethnopluralism sounds all right, but you need to see what's the definition. And what they mean by that is precisely a justification of exclusion, which is clear. Let me just summarize this. So populist nationalism is an ideology which is anti-establishment, anti-immigration, in favor of the national preference principle, and also in favor of ethnopluralism, which is a way of covering up discrimination, because it means I'm an ethnopluralist, so it means that in my society, some people can belong, can be accepted, even some immigrants can be accepted, but there are some that regardless of what they do or think, they will never, ever get in. And that's a very, very important point. Now, after having told you about this type of nationalism, the populist one, I would like to turn to democratic nationalism. I have to say that some people who define themselves as cosmopolitans, and I had this discussion many times with people who are strongly cosmopolitans only, yeah, or close cosmopolitans, as I would say. They are cosmopolitans, but they don't engage in dialogue, so that's a bit problematic too. But anyway, the problem is that some cosmopolitans have a visceral rejection of anything related to nationalism. They don't sit here while I explain the definition, they just go, you know? And that's a problem, because I think that it's always important to listen what the other says and then you judge, at least that, no? But, and for many cosmopolitans, nationalism, regardless of whether it's democratic or not, they associate it with backwardness, with ethnocentrism, with intolerance, and with violence. So everything is under the same definition. My argument is that in many cases, strong cosmopolitans do not engage in a serious analysis of the meaning of nationalism, and they stick to inaccurate definitions. And this is really very important, because in my view, the compatibility between, or the possible compatibility between nationalism and cosmopolitanism depends on how nationalism is defined. And okay, if I come here to you and I ask you, well, let's do it the other way around. I always do that with my students, because you know that in the UK, anything you say, well, you have to apply it to yourself, otherwise somebody may feel offended. So imagine that I tell you, I'm a nationalist, and I'm the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Do you know what policies I'm going to follow? Probably not. Because my argument is to be a nationalist. If I say I'm a nationalist, or if a political leader says I'm a nationalist, you don't know what kind of policies these people are going to follow. So it's crucial to know the political ideology to which nationalism is attached. It's not the same to have a nationalism that's attached to fascism, or to liberal democracy, or to Christian democracy, or to socialism. So the idea that I usually employ is that nationalism is the vase, and then the political ideology is what you fill it with. Okay? You don't know the color of the vase until you've seen what you've poured into that vase. Is it orange juice, so it's going to be red? Or is it water, and it's going to be white? So it's very important that when we talk or consider nationalism, we examine the political ideology that's associated with it. Even today, I would say that this does not only apply to nationalism, because if somebody comes to you and says, I'm a socialist, do you know exactly what kind of policies the person is going to, or that particular person is going to follow? Some you can predict, but others no. And there are fundamental differences between different countries in the European Union, for example, in the West and in the East. So this is basically the argument that I defend here. And I think that also from a cosmopolitan point of view, many people undermine that democratic nationalism has a moral value for some people. Has a moral value because if it says democratic nationalism, in principle means I defend my nation by democratic means, and I engage in dialogue, because dialogue is the key feature of democracy. And also I have a commitment not to use violence, because in democracy, you don't sort out business on differences by using violence. You sort out differences by talking them over, by defining and finding a common playing field, and then agreeing to something. And sometimes you have to give up some elements, and sometimes you have to accept elements from the other person. This is democracy, and this is the element which is important here. So democratic nationalism has a moral value for people, because belonging to the nation for people who feel like that is perceived as a good in itself, because the individual is within the nation that learns to be a democrat. People who are born, why do we have, if you allow me to do this, why do we have some problems about the definition of democracy in Spain? Well, because of the background that we have. Not everybody was brought up knowing that democracy, the dialogue, is the normal thing to sort out problems and to move forward. And this is fundamental. And this applies to the political, social life, but also applies to personal life. So it's within an environment of democracy, within a democratic nation, that individuals learn to be democrats. Also, democratic nationalism fosters a sense of belonging, and usually belonging generates a sense of solidarity among people. Usually there is a sense of solidarity among people who share the same identification with a nation, up to a point, of course, and this is something that varies across time. Also, nationalism provides identity because it is associated with a specific culture, and culture gives the individual some patterns, some values. And nationalism, I'm talking about democratic nationalism, also presents a common project for the future. What's different here? What's the key idea to understand? Is that when a small nation like Catalonia or like Scotland talks about democratic nationalism, they are defined by everybody as nationalists. But the moment, if it comes, that Scotland, imagine for a minute that Scotland becomes independent. Well, probably they are no longer going to be called nationalists, they are going to be called patriots. And this is a very important difference. So all these things need to be debated. And also just 3 features of democratic nationalism which I connect with liberal nationalism, an item that I think at least is of interest to our colleagues here who come from these liberal foundations. No? Liberal nationalism had been defined and had been developed by some scholars, for example, Yael Tamir. And basically, if we summarize in a very brief way, I would say that there are 3 elements that define liberal nationalism, and these are social justice, deliberative democracy, and individual freedom. And I would consider that whenever one tries to assess a specific type of nationalism, you have to examine whether social justice, deliberative democracy functions in that particular context, and individual freedom is also something that's encouraged and protected within the context. Nowadays, we've got a big problem here, in my view. The big problem that we have has to do with social justice. The economic crisis is forcing our governments and forcing ourselves to suffer the consequences and more limitations to the welfare state. This is going to increase inequality within our societies. Inequality means distance between people. And when there is inequality, social justice goes back. Because I consider, from my point of view, one key element that in Europe we have defined in terms of social justice is the welfare state. What's the aim of the welfare state? To give everybody a plain level field where they can at least in education, in health, in opportunities, to have a minimal level for everybody. And then, yes, of course, there is difference, but at least a minimal level. Now, if this level goes down, we are going to find ourselves with a society which is fractured. And this is in my view, one of the most serious consequences of this economic crisis that is going to fracture society. I know that we've got some colleagues from Greece here, and I look forward to listening to them, because in Greece they have very vivid examples of fractures in society already, but also in Spain and in Catalonia, where, for example, Caritas, which is well, a charity, has been increasing the number or has been forced to increase the support that it gives to people who cannot meet their ends at the end of the month or at the end of the week. So I think that there are threats, important threats, to the development of democratic nationalism, but also to the development of cosmopolitanism. Because, and this leads me to the latter part of this talk, so you don't have much longer to wait for, I think. I've been talking about cosmopolitanism, I've been talking about populist nationalism, and I've been talking about democratic nationalism. But yes, we've got examples of democratic nationalism, we've got examples of populist nationalism, but what's the status of cosmopolitanism? Because the problem is that the world is not cosmopolitan. It's not a cosmopolitan place. Even if many countries add a line in their constitutions or in their Charter of Rights, and they add the cosmopolitan sentence, there is a huge gap between what is written in these documents and what happens in reality. Because there is no way to implement cosmopolitan principles. So if I define myself as cosmopolitan, it means automatically that I have to be committed to fight peacefully, democratically, for a radical transformation in the relations of power within that society. Because cosmopolitanism is not here. Our world, just turn on the news or look at the newspaper or look at your iPads or smartphones, the news are not cosmopolitan. We've got something which is quite the opposite, I would say, in many respects. So today, cosmopolitanism is an ideal, is a utopia, because the nation has preference. The nation state is still the main actor in the political sphere. And the nation, as distinct from the state, is that space within which the individual has some rights. This is why there is still some attachment to the state, because individuals look for some spaces where their rights can be protected. And even here, there are very significant differences among the different rights that people from different countries enjoy. I see this, and it's something which is important, and sometimes we need to be aware that these differences exist. But to conclude, I just would like to say that in my view, and obviously it's my view, debatable, questionable, democratic nationalism is legitimate. It defends the right of nations to exist and develop while respecting internal diversity. And this has to be an aspiration, and in my view, has to be an objective. But I don't think we have to leave it here. Because our world is not cosmopolitan, we just don't have to stop with the nation or with this democratic nationalism. I think we need to aspire to go further. And what I'm defending is that individuals need to be able to add a cosmopolitan layer to this democratic nationalism. Because individuals, beyond being preoccupied and engaged with their own nation, they have also to be engaged with the world that needs this cosmopolitan dimension. What we cannot do is to argue that after globalization we live in a cosmopolitan, interdependent world, and then not to be engaged in the development, in the expansion of these cosmopolitan values around the world. I would leave it here. Thank you. I think that your question is more related to the idea of political unity or economic unity, political or economic integration. This goes back to the ideas advanced by Jacques Delors when he was the head of the European Union. At the moment, I think that there is some talk, but basically there is a lot of uncertainty and disorganization in the European Union. There is lack of agreement about how to move forward. We've got a very weak leadership in the European Union. And while this leadership is so weak, the economy is going down. And obviously this gives a lot more leeway to specific nations to be defending their own views. Let be David Cameron in the UK saying that he's going to have a referendum to leave the EU or to impose new treaties, or be it the Scots saying, well, we would like to at least consider the possibility of independence and we want a vote within the European Union. It's a moment of change. Things are, or events and situations are in flux at the moment. It's very hard to say one thing or the other, but what I would say is that within the idea that democracy has to be upheld in the European Union and some kind of cosmopolitan layer has to be added to it, because the European Union has traditionally acted as an element of integration and in favor of sorting out problems using democratic means, as opposed to the hard way of the most powerful nations in the world. I think that this is now probably more valuable than ever before. And the second question was about the role of activism. Well, of course, what we are seeing across Europe is a certain, well, first of all, there is a certain degree of political mobilization. Political mobilization is very important, but political mobilization needs to have a clear objective. Otherwise, it's very easy to manipulate it and to employ it for different means. And we've seen this. When we've got a political mobilization that has lots of people together but not a clear idea, they can make anything they want of it. And after that, it's transformed. And we've seen this in the case of the revolutions in the Middle East. We've even seen this across Europe in these movements of protest that we saw across the summer. In terms of education, I think it's fundamental to have a good education that prepares people to be critical and helps them to develop the ability to think. But so far, I just don't think this is a priority. Children are more likely to be able to use a computer early on in their life than to engage in a debate or to be critical about something. And this, in my view, modest view, is a problem. Well, I've got a paper about that. I can send this to you because in the UK we had, English. Yeah, because in the UK we had a program about what mainstream political parties could do to fight the populism of the extreme right, of the new radical right. Some of the things, I mean, in most European countries, mainstream parties have already taken some measures to limit immigration, to control certain aspects, like, for example, is it true that immigrants get preference everywhere, as some of these radical right parties are saying? Is it true that they are the first to get a new flat? I know these are sticky questions, very, very hard. But, you know, in the UK, we really had to make the effort, and the Labour Party already started to basically establish a clear difference between the rights of citizens and human rights. That's a That's a difficult thing, yeah? But if you are a citizen of a state, of a nation state, you contribute, you pay taxes, and you've got certain rights. You can vote there. But this is different than having your human rights respected. And this difference is something that in the UK has been employed, at least by the Labour Party, to really say, well, we are doing something to control immigration, to control all these things that you are saying. So I think that this is a very important argument to really take some measures and to publicize the measures, because many governments do things, but they don't let people know that they are doing them. And another specific point which is important in this particular sense has to do with the different policies that are implemented. No? And it's also very important that nation states are able to guarantee that there is going to be social mobility within a specific state. Social mobility is crucial, and these are some of the issues that can be done to confront this kind of discourse. But I think that it's also very significant whether mainstream parties actually know what are the problems faced by normal citizens, because there is a big distance, and it's like, well, let's talk about how to confront Le Front National, and we are going to go to La Brasserie, I don't know what, and we're going to have this fantastic meal with le huître and, you know, and then we've decided, well, that we are going to write a pamphlet. Well, this is something that the citizenship sometimes perceives, and the distance between politicians and the discourse of these political parties that seek populist arguments is something that it's present in here. No? I think that the main way, I mean, there are some arguments that, in my view, is extremely hard to confront, because you don't find these arguments in society. But I think it's important to stress this difference basically between the citizenship and human rights. La pregunta dels 10 anys. Això és bastant curiós, perquè era al final d'una entrevista que em van fer al 324 i de cop, sense dir-me res, em pregunten, bueno, i quan serà? Clar, a veure, vostès poden comprendre que una pregunta com aquesta doncs és realment molt seriosa, no? I llavors allò que dius és en directe, s'ha de respondre. Per què vaig dir 10 anys? Perquè vostè em podria dir els anys que s'ha trigat en el procés de l'Estatut del 2006? Val? Des del moment en què es planteja, s'escriu, és a dir, es defineix, es vota, el viatge, l'Estatut, va, ve de Madrid, torna, es posa a la nevera, descansa, va al Tribunal Constitucional, finalment un resultat. Aquests processos són, a veure, són una mica lents. Llavors jo vaig dir 10 anys perquè considero que un procés, és a dir, si realment el camí cap a la independència es porta a terme, no és un camí que d'un dia per l'altre ja s'és independent, és a dir, ja ha d'existir un procés. I a mi em va semblar que en 10 anys era factible complir tots els estadis d'aquest procés. Amb això vull dir, clar, la declaració d'independència comporta pactar el deute de l'Estat, comporta redissenyar el sistema de recaptació d'impostos comporta fer traspassos d'edificis i d'altres béns que poden ser de l'Estat i estan a Catalunya. Comportaria tota una sèrie d'acords i de negociacions. Comporta arribar a acords en temes de defensa, en temes estratègics, en temes fins i tot de subministrament elèctric. Vull dir que no és allò de que ja està. Si l'Estatut, siguent el que era i va acabar com va acabar, va trigar tant temps, a mi em va semblar que 10 anys era un nombre prudent. Després, en quant a procés, li dic això, exactament el procés tampoc li puc definir, perquè considero que el procés l'han de definir els polítics arran d'anar obtenint legitimitat per part de la ciutadania de Catalunya per tirar endavant el que sigui la voluntat de la ciutadania de Catalunya. A veure, tu fixa't bé el que m'has dit. M'has dit, en Fuster parla de 2 tipus de nacionalisme. Nacionalisme d'estat, expansionisme, imposa, i un nacionalisme d'alliberament. Llavors jo et pregunto, el país X té un nacionalisme d'alliberament. Arriba a aconseguir un estat. Vol dir llavors que es torna expansionista? Ho dic perquè a mi em sembla, modestament, que aquesta definició funciona fins a un cert punt, perquè aquesta definició també està d'alguna manera assumint que tot estat és expansionista i no tots els estats són expansionistes i n'hi ha molts que mai ni tan sols s'han plantejat ser expansionistes. Llavors, esclar, tampoc hem d'anar a arrasar amb tot el que ens trobem pel davant, per dir-ho d'alguna manera, no? Però és molt important que hagis presentat aquesta pregunta, perquè igual que diem nacionalisme, quin tipus, estat-nació, quin tipus d'estat-nació? És el mateix a Luxemburg que de Netherlands o la Gran Bretanya o Espanya? Jo no contestaré la pregunta. Amb això em sembla que ja es contesta sola, ¿no? Usted me ha hecho la pregunta más difícil de la tarde o de la mañana, porque evidentemente, a ver, yo le preguntaría, usted me dice, ¿cuáles serían las mejores políticas para los musulmanes? Yo le tengo que decir, bueno, ¿los musulmanes qué quieren? Porque claro, hasta que yo no sepa qué quieran, no sé cuáles serían para ustedes las mejores políticas. Esto viene intrínseco aquí. Ahora, en cuanto a la situación del Islam, pues obviamente la situación es difícil porque en el Islam existen distintas corrientes. Desafortunadamente, en los últimos años, el fundamentalismo islámico, igual que otros tipos de fundamentalismo, ojo, fundamentalismo de mercado, fundamentalismo religioso de otras religiones, ha tomado fuerza. ¿Y esto qué ha hecho? Les ha dado mala fama. En el Reino Unido existe esta mala fama. Políticas mejores para los musulmanes. Yo considero que una política buena es la política que defiende la diversidad y permite la diversidad. Considero que esto es positivo. Considero también que el multiculturalismo en la Gran Bretaña ha favorecido enormemente la integración de algunos grupos, no solamente musulmanes, sino de otras religiones. Pero existen problemas muy importantes. El problema más importante es que los valores y los principios del Islam en algunos puntos son totalmente opuestos a los principios de una democracia liberal. Y eso depende de qué tipo de Islam tiene, porque yo en Londres estoy, Queen Mary está en el East End de Londres, es la zona donde están las mezquitas y sé que tengo que ir a una mezquita para tener la versión light de los más tradicional y tengo que ir a otra mezquita para tener la versión más combativa. Con lo cual, depende de la mezquita que yo vaya, si solo voy a una me quedo con una visión, ¿no? El Islam, el problema más grande tiene que ver con el fundamentalismo islámico. Y en el Reino Unido el problema grande que tenemos en estos momentos, desde mi punto de vista, es que mientras la primera generación de personas pues, de Pakistán o de Bangladesh vinieron al Reino Unido, se instalaron, hicieron un gran esfuerzo para integrarse, grandísimo esfuerzo, trabajaron durísimamente. La segunda generación consiguió situarse más o menos. Y ahora incluso tenemos algunos elementos de la comunidad islámica muy valorados y que son figuras públicas influyentes en la cultura británica. Pero la tercera generación, las cosas han cambiado, porque la sociedad británica, también influida por la crisis económica, no es capaz de otorgar las mismas posibilidades de movilidad social a esta tercera generación que las posibilidades que dio a la segunda generación, por ejemplo. Y esto crea un resentimiento profundo. Además, culturalmente, vamos, yo tengo alumnos musulmanes en clase y me dicen, la cultura occidental, pues ¿qué identidad inglesa es buena? Si lo que hacen el viernes es beber hasta que caen borrachos por el suelo, y eso es verdad, es verdad, es verdad, es cierto, es así. Entonces, ¿qué valores son estos? ¿Y van detrás de las mujeres todo el tiempo? Bueno, y hasta aquí, pues sí, pero claro, esto no es lo único. Entonces yo creo que el problema requiere otra conferencia y requiere un debate importante. ¿Qué hacer? Yo considero que profundizar en la democracia es siempre positivo, pero creo que esta democratización tiene que venir por dos bandas. Por parte del Estado, ya que hablamos del Reino Unido, y también por parte de las distintas comunidades. Porque si se vive dentro de una comunidad específica, considero que hay para mí, y esto evidentemente ustedes pueden discrepar, hay algunos puntos que no son negociables. Entonces, bueno, que yo tenga alumnos que no me miren a la cara porque soy una mujer, pues bueno. Bien, usted nunca ha visto la burka en Marruecos, porque bueno, la burka es un tipo de vestido que no es ninguna obligación que las mujeres lleven, al menos no lo es, de acuerdo con el Corán, al menos hay interpretaciones de este tipo, y existen distintas posturas acerca de la burka, del hijab y de los distintos tipos de velo que utilizan las mujeres. Yo le puedo decir que en mi universidad sí tenemos alumnas con burka, y en las clases pues también. Entonces, bueno, esto depende. ¿Qué quiere decir? Pues que realmente los objetivos que puede tener la comunidad musulmana en España y en Cataluña en particular, y en Barcelona como ciudad, pues yo considero que van a ser distintos. Y es posible que en algunos momentos lo que sea su interés en Cataluña, en España, esté muy distante de lo que sean los intereses en el Reino Unido. Y en el Reino Unido también depende de las comunidades, porque usted sabe que existen diferentes councils, Muslim councils, y cada council tiene una postura concreta. Tenemos los salafistas, tenemos los distintos versiones, ¿no? Las distintas versiones. Entonces, obviamente, esto marca la diferencia, ¿no? ¿Que todos los musulmanes se sienten catalanes y españoles? Yo no me lo creo. Y que todos los catalanes consideran que los musulmanes son catalanes, No, claro que no, pero que todos los catalanes piensan que los musulmanes son, en fin, como un demonio casi, pues tampoco. Es decir, yo considero que como esto es un elemento nuevo en la sociedad catalana y española, existe espacio para construir una imagen positiva y de convivencia. Y considero que aquí existe una posibilidad mucho mayor, mucho más rica, de la que puede haber en países como el Reino Unido, donde estas relaciones a veces se han anquilosado y existen ya diferencias muy marcadas y resentimientos profundos, con razón tanto en un bando como en el otro. Pero yo considero que en Cataluña es una oportunidad estupenda que tenemos el poder convivir y poder disfrutar de la riqueza de dos culturas distintas pero que ya han convivido en el pasado. L'estratègia de la por funciona? Amb algunes persones sí que funciona. I funciona amb la gent gran, entre d'altres, perquè ells han passat la por i saben el que és la por. Jo li dic perquè penso en els meus pares o penso en persones que tenen aquesta experiència, que saben què és, que por no és només una paraula, por és un record. De totes maneres, també s'ha de tenir en compte quin percentatge de població estaria afectat per això. També cal dir que a vegades els pobles, igual que les persones, quan més se'ls diu que no facin una cosa, més ganes tenen de fer-la. Això tots ho sabem, vull dir, tots ens ha passat, no? Que això ens ho prohibeixen i oi, mira, quina gràcia, vull dir, realment això, aquest factor existeix. I després, esclar, si es fa una política, en aquests moments jo considero que la reacció del govern britànic que ha canviat el que és l'equivalent de la seva pròpia Constitució per acomodar el fet de que Escòcia pugui portar a terme un referèndum, però ho ha fet perquè és la manera d'actuar normal en un país democràtic. Tens una part molt important de la població que et demana una cosa, l'estat és democràtic i dius bé, doncs anem a veure com podem acomodar això. Una altra cosa és que en David Cameron ja ha dit que ell lluitarà amb totes les seves forces perquè surti el no, però el que no farà és prohibir que el poble decideixi. Considero que això està tenint un impacte molt fort en la societat catalana, molt fort, perquè a Catalunya penso que ha arrelat molt la idea de que la democràcia va costar molt d'aconseguir i que ara la tenim, la democràcia, de que hi ha alguna cosa que tenim el dret. De totes maneres també està per veure com es desenvoluparà, no? Però jo diria que la por amb un sector més gran d'edat sí, els joves, més joves crec que no, però evidentment el seu objectiu és anar dient tota una sèrie de coses que la gent la tiri enrere. El que passa és que, esclar, el tipus de coses que s'utilitzen, el tipus d'arguments que s'utilitzen per tirar enrere els catalans, ja de fer un referèndum o de poder triar, i el tipus de coses, els arguments que s'utilitzen en el debat al Regne Unit quan es considera si a Escòcia li aniria bé o no ser independent, són radicalment diferents. Allà a ningú se li ha acudit mai fer una amenaça d'aquest tipus perquè és que no entra en un diàleg democràtic. Encara que estiguis ferotgement en contra de que Escòcia faci el referèndum, però hi ha coses que en democràcia saps que a vegades el que a tu t'agrada no toca. Well, there is a difference, because when we talk about nationalism, nationalism is the sentiment of belonging to the nation, and the nation has a specific meaning. What is a nation? When you say that people are members of a nation, it means that they are all conscious that they are Catalans or Flemish or Basques or English. So there is a common consciousness. But a nation also has a specific culture, specific history, it has also an attachment to a specific territory, and the nation, when we talk about a nation, we talk about a community of people who wish to decide about their future, whatever this might be. They may just wish to decide to be a province within a larger state. They may just want to decide to be a region, or have different levels, but they have a common will. In terms of localism, usually you don't have the same characteristics. First of all, because the culture, a national culture, is not quite the same as a local culture. And the same could be applied to territory and to the other attributes. So I think that the nation has played and continues to play a key role as a community with which individuals tend to identify, even if they define the nation in different ways. But nowadays, the nation is probably, or represents, the strongest attachment of many individuals, at least in the Western world. Després, Isabel, el teu comentari, valuosíssim com sempre, perquè evidentment és cert que s'ha explotat el tema, és a dir, s'ha explotat el mot cosmopolitisme. S'ha explotat i s'ha utilitzat com una cirereta que es posa al capdamunt d'un pastís, no? Cosmopolita i ja està, ja quedava més bé, sense anar als orígens. I això, evidentment, ha fet mal a l'expressió. Això estic totalment d'acord amb tu. I would leave it here. Thank you.